here is the secret to authentic joy and authentic peace. Brothers and sisters, may the Lord give you his peace. Good to be here with you again. Fr Malachy on the way, inviting you to continue walking with me as we're following the footsteps of Jesus. You know, the world that we live in, right? There's like all sorts of crises. There's all sorts of things that are going on, like at national, international levels, right? And like anxiety can easily rise up in the midst of that. But there's also realities in our own lives where there's places where we have struggle, suffering, difficulty, unanswered questions, right, in our lives. And again, those are places of tension inside of us that often give birth, right, to fear, to anxiety, to all sorts of different things. And in the midst of those situations, we hear Jesus like telling us, right, that peace I give to you, not as the world gives. And we hear St. Paul telling us, rejoice in the Lord always. And it's just interesting to think, like, is that possible? Is it possible to rejoice and to have peace always? As a friar, the answer to that question for me was given so beautifully by a woman that I met in Nicaragua some years ago. Her name's Guillermina, this older woman who was a widow who lived in a shack in one of the poorest parts of Matagalpa, Nicaragua, where I was serving as a missionary. And we would go and give food away to the poor in a particular neighborhood weekly, and we would pass by her house, and so we'd often stop. When I say Guillermina's house, what I mean is she had some 1x2s that were tied together with black plastic pulled over it, and some branches that were also like kind of tied together to make a little bit of a swinging door with, again, black plastic, like the kind of stuff that you would put underneath a house to be able to like seal the basement or something like that. Just like 3mm black plastic. That was her house. And so we'd stop there and we would, say hello to her, give her some food. And I remember one of those times she said, do you want to come in? And Guillermina, every time we saw her, was like smiling from ear to ear. The most joyful person, honestly, I think that I have met. And it was like every time we come by, she'd come running out. She'd be like, hola, padre, how are you doing? ¿Cómo están? And she would give us big old hugs and a kiss on the cheek and just like fill with life and fill with joy. And I said, yeah, I'd love to go into your house. And so I walk in, open the door, and I go in. And in the corner against the wall are a number of branches that have been lashed together about 2 feet off the ground with a blanket that's on top of them. And that was her bed. Like, this is where she was sleeping. And the house that she was living in was next to the water sewage place on top of all of this, right? I look around, it's a dirt floor. There's nothing else inside of Guillermina's home except one thing. On one of the walls, sort of like, tacked up on there, is a crucifix with Jesus, and next to it a picture of Mary and her Immaculate Heart. And as I looked at that and I looked at her, it was like I just realized, like, here's the secret. Like, here's the secret to authentic joy and authentic peace. Having the cross of Jesus at the center, Jesus, his love made visible for me, his declaration of the power of love over death and sin, right? His presence, Jesus there at the center, and his mother with her heart that welcomes us. And that in their presence, it was like this place that was a black plastic covered shack was like radiant. It was radiant with the presence of God, with the peace of the kingdom. And Guillermina was radiant with that peace and that joy herself. And I've never forgotten that moment. I've never forgotten those eyes and that face and that smile. Because in my life, again and again, I find myself distracted too often, putting something or someone else at the center of my life. And I remember Guillermina, and I remember that shack, and I remember that in the midst of this like destitution, not even poverty, like that's destitution. In the midst of destitution, in the midst of so much ugliness visibly around, so much suffering the story of her life held, her heart was filled with joy and it was filled with peace because Jesus and Mary were at the center of it. And that joy and peace is available to you and to me wherever I'm at, whatever is going on in my life. I still remember back in the pandemic in 2020, as anxiety levels are rising in my own heart over all the sorts of things that I was impacted by, especially my priestly ordination being completely changed from what I thought it was going to be to just 10 people in a chapel in Newark, New Jersey. I remember in the midst of that, like God gave me this beautiful word of revelation. And it was that all of the places in my life and my heart at that moment that were being filled with anxiety and fear were a place where I was holding on to something or someone other than Jesus. And I would just say with Guillermina, it's like there's something for us, almost like an examination of conscience, an invitation to a way of looking at our life and looking at the world. That is to say, anywhere where I'm holding on to, right? Like big scale, political, social, world news kind of situation as the center point of my life and my attention, or I'm holding on to a person or a relationship or a career or whatever it could be that I've got at the center of my life that's not Him, it's not Jesus and His Blessed Mother. That's a place where fear and anxiety are going to be just free to roam. But when I allow the cross, Jesus, His mother, to be at the center of my life, a miracle that is beyond explanation happens. And I can stand in the midst of a black shack and be in the midst of heaven on earth. I can stand in the midst of suffering and pain and even, terminal illness. I can stand in the midst of war. I can stand in the midst of whatever may be happening in my life. And with Jesus and Mary at the center, there's peace. Peace I give to you, not as the world gives, but also there's joy. Jesus says, in this world you'll have trouble, but guess what? Be of good cheer because I've conquered the world. It's the joy that already, even though not fully, we are experiencing salvation. That already we are tasting the goodness of heaven, even here on earth in the midst of this valley of tears. It's possible. It's real. It's exactly what God desires to give to us. So let's let go of fear. Let's let go of anxiety. Let's put Jesus and Mary at the center of our lives and experience the beautiful fruit of peace and joy that come flowing out of that. God bless.